It started with a sentence that should have been impossible to say out loud. An 81-year-old woman. Wool coat, white hair, hands that had not stopped trembling since she sat down, leaned across a diner table in Callaway, Missouri at 11:30 on a Wednesday night and whispered 6 words to a stranger who had never seen her face before in his life. "They're going to take my house." The man across from her was a Hells Angels rider named Hatch Dillon. He was 6'2", 230 pounds, and his face was the kind of face that most people in late-night diners did not lean toward. They leaned away from it. He had spent 3 hours on an empty Missouri highway to get here, and he had been planning to drink 1 coffee and keep moving. He looked at her. He looked at the way her hands were shaking against the tabletop. He looked at the diner door and the dark parking lot beyond it, and the empty black of Route 7 running away in both directions. Then she said it a second time, barely a sound, the same 6 words again, no more than breath moving across a table, and something in the repetition told him exactly what he needed to know about how long she had been saying it to herself in the dark before she found the courage to say it to someone else. "They're going to take my house." Hatch Dillon did not keep moving that night. What he did in the 7 hours between that whisper and sunrise would not be forgotten in Callaway, Missouri for a very long time. Not by Agnes, not by the town, and not by the man in the pressed sport coat who arrived at the Callaway County Courthouse at 7 the next morning and found something waiting for him in that parking lot that no amount of his planning had prepared him for. The Callaway Diner sat at the intersection of Route 7 and Mill Road, a mile east of town, and it had the look of a place that had been refusing to close for 30 years on stubbornness alone. Red vinyl on the booths, split at the seams. A Formica counter with 9 stools. The smell of burnt coffee and griddle grease, and the cold that came in every time the door opened. A half-moon hung low and yellowish over the water tower to the north. 2 semi-trucks idled at the far end of the parking lot, and otherwise the lot was empty. This was a Wednesday night in a small town where the mills had been quiet since 2008. The Callaway Diner at 11 in the evening had the atmosphere of a waiting room for people who hadn't decided what they were waiting for. Hatch Dillon had been riding since 7 that evening. He was 48 years old, built like a man who had spent 2 decades doing work that couldn't be undone once it started. Broad shoulders, forearms thick from 30 years of road weight, a jaw that had been broken and reset at 32, and sat slightly off-center in a way people noticed without being able to say why. His cut carried the Death's Head patch, and below it, Ohio. 11 years of patches accumulated at chapter runs and memorial rides, and the harder occasions that didn't have names for the outside world. When he walked into a room, he walked into it completely. People felt the change before they identified the cause. He was riding to Cape Girardeau. His sister Carol was turning 50 on Thursday morning and had made him promise, not request, promise, over the phone 2 months prior, that he would be there for breakfast. He was running behind. He had stopped at Callaway for coffee and 15 quiet minutes away from the thoughts that long highways at night had a way of amplifying. The thought he had been riding away from all evening was a specific one. His mother, Marion, had died 3 years ago in a state-contracted care facility in Springfield while Hatch was on a run to Nashville. His phone died between Knoxville and Memphis, and by the time he got Carol's voicemail, it had been 16 hours. He had replayed those 16 hours on many highways since. He kept starting the replay. He had never found anything useful at the end of it. He ordered his coffee and sat with his back to the wall. He was looking at the door when the old woman in the corner booth stood up and walked toward him. She had chosen him. He could see that. She had sat in the corner for a while. He had clocked her when he came in. The careful eyes of a man who notes everyone in a room, and she had looked at the counter and the other booths and at Hatch. And she had made a decision, and stood up and come over the way a person walks toward the only lit window on a dark street. She sat down across from him. She folded her trembling hands on the table. She leaned forward, and she whispered, "Before we get to what Agnes told him, and what Hatch did with less than 7 hours until sunrise, hit subscribe and drop your city and state in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Wherever you're watching from, a kitchen table in Tennessee, a front porch in Nebraska, a hotel room anywhere, drop your city below. I read every single one, and if you know someone who's been in a place like Agnes was, who needed someone to show up and nobody came, stay with us, because this one is for them." Now, back to the Callaway Diner. Because what Agnes Faye Morrell had been carrying alone for 8 months was about to find the one man in Missouri who knew exactly what to do with it. Agnes Faye Morrell was 81 years old. She had lived in Callaway, Missouri her entire life, except for 2 years in the late 1960s, when she and her husband Eugene moved to Kansas City for his work. And she had missed Missouri so completely during those 2 years that Eugene came home one Tuesday evening to find her crying over a photograph of nothing more dramatic than a cornfield. And he looked at the photograph for a long time and then said they were going back. And they did. They came home to Callaway in 1971. They bought a lot on Leland Road for $6,000 and built the house themselves over the next 2 years, Eugene and his brother doing the framing and the roof, Agnes finishing every inch of the drywall and painting every room, both of them there evenings and weekends, until the house stood exactly as they had imagined it. 3 bedrooms, a porch that faced west and caught the last light on summer evenings, a kitchen window that looked out on the garden Eugene planted every spring until his hands got too unsteady. They had raised 2 children in that house and buried one. Eugene died in January 2020, pneumonia, during the worst winter in a decade. He was 83. Agnes had been alone in the house on Leland Road since then. Her daughter lived in Phoenix and called on Sundays. The calls were fine. They were not the same as someone at the kitchen table. She had put on her good wool coat to come out tonight. She always put on her good coat to go out, even when there was no occasion, because that was the kind of woman she was, and she saw no reason to stop being that woman now. 8 months ago, a letter had come from a company called Greer Land and Title Solutions. It cited an outstanding balance owed to the Leland Road Homeowners Association, $12,400 in unpaid assessments, with penalties accrued since 2011. The HO had been formed in 2003 for a brief period of neighborhood upkeep and had dissolved by member vote in September 2009. Agnes had the dissolution notice in a filing cabinet. The county, it seemed, had not found it. She had fought it. She had filed responses. She had been assigned a public defender, a young man named Tyler who seemed sincere and overwhelmed, who stopped returning her calls in September. The foreclosure action was scheduled for 7 o'clock Thursday morning at the Callaway County Courthouse. Agnes had not slept in 3 days. She had come to the Callaway Diner because the silence in the house on Leland Road had reached a pitch she could no longer stay inside of. She had sat in the corner booth with a cup of tea that went cold in her hands. She had looked around the room. And then she had made a choice that took everything she had left. She had laid her hands flat on the table across from the large man in the leather cut. She had whispered, "Tell me all of it," Hatch said. She did. The papers were in her purse. She had started carrying them everywhere after Tyler stopped answering, because the folder in the filing cabinet felt too far from her hands, and she laid them on the table one at a time. The HOA assessment notice, The initial complaint filing. The final judgment, the letter that had arrived 6 days ago with the 7 o'clock time printed at the top like a countdown someone else had set for her life. Hatch read them slowly, the way he did everything, not uncertain, just thorough. He turned each page and set it face down to his right when he finished it. He was on the third document when the diner door opened. Marcus Greer was 52 years old, dressed in a sport coat wrong for a roadside diner in Missouri, trim and carrying a leather document case with the ease of a man who has never felt outweighed in a room. He stood at the door, scanned the counter and booths, found Agnes in the corner, and let his eyes rest on the man sitting across from her, 1 second longer than necessary. He crossed the room and stopped at the booth. "Agnes," he said. "Late night." Agnes's hands, which had gone still while she talked, began trembling again. "I'm with someone," Agnes said. "I can see that." Greer set his document case on the table's edge, without asking. He produced a single-page summary and placed it in front of Agnes, with the efficiency of a man who has made this gesture 11 times before. 7 o'clock. Courtroom B. The judgment is uncontested. The window for filing any challenge closed 8 weeks ago. He adjusted the paper so it sat squarely in front of her. "We can discuss personal property, any items you'd like to arrange pickup for before the transfer." "She understands the timeline," Hatch said. Greer looked at him for the first time. A long, measuring look, arriving at a comfortable answer. He decided the answer was not very much. "Sir, this is a legal matter, I know what it is," Hatch said. Greer kept his eyes on Hatch for a moment. Then, he looked back at Agnes. "I'd encourage you not to let anyone give you false hope, Agnes. The legal clock has run." He straightened his jacket. He looked once more at the table, the papers, the untouched tea, the 81-year-old woman's trembling hands, and he smiled with his mouth and not his eyes. 7 o'clock, he said, and walked back toward the counter. The diner went quiet. The trucker at the counter looked at his plate. The night shift nurse with her coffee looked harder at her coffee. The waitress froze at the far end of the counter. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Marcus Greer had filed 11 of these actions in 2 years, against 11 people who all had one thing in common. When the room went silent, no one got up. He had counted on that silence every single time, and it had never failed him. And he sat down at the counter 3 stools from the door and ordered a second coffee and watched the corner booth in the mirror behind the pie case. Greer did not leave. He sat at the counter and he watched. Agnes had gone very still, looking at the single-page summary he had left in front of her. Assessed property value, outstanding total. Personal property removal timeline. A line at the bottom about key surrender. "How many others?" Hatch asked. Agnes looked up. 11, she said. "In 2 years. I talked to a woman from Redfield who lost hers in September. 62 years in her house. He came to her kitchen the night before, just like this." Hatch looked at her. "He came to yours?" 4 days ago. He knocked on the door. Her voice had dropped. "He said there was no point in showing up Thursday morning. He said it would only make it harder on me." She looked at the summary on the table. "My daughter wants me to come to Phoenix. She says I can live with her. She says a house is just a house." She stopped. She pressed her lips together hard. When she spoke again, it was barely a sound. "Eugene and I built that house board by board. He wrote the room measurements on the concrete in the basement in marker before we framed the walls. His handwriting is still down there." She whispered it. "I cannot let someone else live in that house." Hatch had not looked away from her face. He looked down at the papers. He looked at the Ho assessment notice. He read the association name, Leland Road Homeowners Association. He found the date of the first assessment cited, March 2011. He looked at the dissolution notice Agnes had included in the folder. It was dated September 22, 2009, dissolved by member vote, filed with the county recorder. Signed, he read those two dates again. He set the paper down. Behind them, at the counter, Greer's stool creaked. He was watching. The trucker at the far end of the counter had his eyes on his coffee. The night shift nurse had started looking at her phone. Nobody in the Callaway diner was going to move for Agnes Faye Morrell tonight, and Marcus Greer had made 11 successful calculations based on exactly that fact. Hatch read the document for 40 seconds. He set it down. He took out his phone and made a call that lasted 11 seconds. Nobody at that counter heard what he said. The person on the other end of that call was a man named Delbert Conway. Del had been a Hell's Angel for 16 years before he put himself through law school at 42 on stubbornness and chapter support, and the specific energy of a man who has decided the law is a tool and he intends to learn how to use it. He had been practicing for 9 years since. At 11:50 on a Wednesday night in October, he was asleep with his phone on loud, because his phone had been on loud since the day the chapter started calling him. He answered on the second ring. Hatch read him the HOA name. He read him the dissolution date. He read him the date on the first assessment. He said 2 sentences more. There was a silence on the line. "Give me 45 minutes, Del said. Hatch put his phone on the table. He looked at Agnes. He did not stand and walk toward Marcus Greer. He did not raise his voice. He sat with his hands flat on the table in the corner booth, which was not a frightening thing to look at. It was the calmest thing in the room. The trucker and the waitress and the night shift nurse all glanced at the booth and looked away with nothing to describe. "Agnes," he said, "do you have the original deed?" She looked at him the way a person looks when they have stopped expecting things and something arrives anyway, not quite believing it, afraid of what it costs to believe it wrong. "At the house," she said. "We're going to need it." "I don't understand what you're doing," she said. "The Ho that issued this lien dissolved in 2009, Hatch said. First assessment on yours is dated 2011. Dissolved organizations can't issue legal debt. The lien is fraudulent." He turned the paper so she could see the 2 dates side by side. "Del's pulling the county records now. Dissolution's on file. Injunction can be filed tonight." Agnes looked at the dates. She looked up. "It's nearly midnight," she said. "I know," Hatch said. He took out his phone and sent a text to the thread labeled Brothers. 2 words. Callaway. Now he put his phone face down on the table and picked up his coffee. Marcus Greer had seen the second phone call. He had been watching the booth in the mirror, and he had seen Hatch's expression during it, and something about that expression made him set his coffee cup down and slide off the stool and walk back to the booth. He stopped at the edge of the table. "I hope you're not complicating this woman's situation further," Greer said. He kept his voice at the register of someone explaining something simple. The window for any legal challenge closed 8 weeks ago. Anything filed tonight would be dismissed at the hearing. "I've seen this kind of thing. The HOA dissolved in 2009, Hatch said. Greer blinked. "The lien is from 2011, Hatch said. "Clerical discrepancies in the originating filings don't. Del Conway's pulling the county records." Hatch looked at him steadily. "Dissolution's on file. Lien is fraudulent, not a discrepancy." A silence fell over that corner of the diner that was different from the room's normal quiet. The waitress had stopped moving. The trucker had set his fork down and was looking at the booth. The night shift nurse had looked up. Greer stood at the booth's edge. He was recalculating, quickly, privately, the way a man recalculates when a variable he has never encountered enters the equation. He had won 11 times. He had won because the variable had always been the same. One person, no resources, no time, no one to call. He looked at Hatch Dillon and he saw, for the first time that evening, that the variable had changed. 7 o'clock, he said. He picked up his document case and walked to the counter and settled his bill and left. The diner door swung shut behind him. Agnes looked at the door. She looked at Hatch. She was trembling slightly and holding the dissolution notice in both hands. "He'll be making calls," Hatch said. "That's fine." From outside, far down Route 7 to the north, something began. Too low at first to be certain of. Too rhythmic to be wind. The particular pulse of distance being closed at speed. Agnes looked up from the paper. "Is that?" she started. "Yes," Hatch said. Engines. 180 of them, converging on Callaway, Missouri from 3 directions in the October dark, the sound arriving long before the headlights appeared, low and building and layered in the way of many machines moving with shared intent. The Callaway diner's windows shivered. The glasses on the counter shivered with them. The jukebox rattled once on its shelf. The waitress went to the window. The trucker stood up from his stool. The kid at the back table, who had been doing homework, lifted his head and looked at the glass. The headlights came first. Twin white circles emerging from the dark down Route 7, more appearing at the Mill Road Junction, more from the on-ramp to the north, until the parking lot of the Callaway Diner was a moving field of light. They filed in with precision, not chaos, not rushing. The arrangement of people who know exactly where they are going and what they are doing, and why silence is better than noise when the moment requires it. The engines cut. 180 machines going quiet in near unison. The silence of it was physical, sudden, complete. The kind that replaces one quality of air with another. The parking lot held chrome and leather, and the faint tick of cooling metal, and the cold Missouri night pressing in. Agnes Faye Morrell looked out the window at the rows of motorcycles stretching to the road. She said nothing. She was not able to for a moment. One man came through the door first. Luther Briggs was 61 years old, built like a man who had never stopped doing hard physical work, with a gray braid down the left side of his neck, and a road captain's patch that had been on his cut for decades. He walked through the diner without looking at the counter and found Hatch Dillon's eyes from across the room. "Hatch put out the call," Luther said. "We answered." He looked at Agnes. His eyes moved to her good wool coat, to her trembling hands, to the papers spread across the table, to the dissolution notice she had been holding for hours, to the cup of cold tea. Something in his face broke, not dramatically, not in a way another person could easily name, just a small, irreversible change in the set of it. The expression of a man who has seen something he recognizes completely. Luther Briggs had a mother. She was 78 and lived alone in a house outside Akron she had defended through 2 foreclosure attempts in the last 4 years. He did not talk about it. He looked at Agnes Faye Morrell and understood everything without being told a word. He pulled off his riding gloves and extended a hand across the table. "Ma'am," he said, "we need to get to the courthouse before 6. Behind him, the diner filled. 180 men, the smell of cold leather and October road, and the particular quiet of people who have come somewhere on purpose. Agnes looked at the hand across the table. She looked at Luther. She looked at Hatch. She took the hand. She was not trembling anymore. The Callaway County records were pulled remotely by Delbert Conway at 2:17 in the morning. The Leland Road Homeowners Association dissolution was in the file, correctly recorded in September 2009, signed by the county recorder, filed in triplicate. It had been there the entire time. The lien Greer Land and Title Solutions had used to begin foreclosure proceedings on Agnes Faye Morrell was based on a debt that could not legally exist, issued by an organization that had ceased to exist 2 years before the first alleged assessment. The emergency injunction was filed at 4:55 in the morning and granted at 6:12 over the phone by a circuit judge who had seen Del Conway's name on enough legitimate filings to trust the emergency classification. At 7 o'clock, Marcus Greer walked across the parking lot of the Callaway County Courthouse with his document case and the expression of a man who has done something 11 successful times and sees no reason the 12th should differ. He stopped walking. He stood in the parking lot. He did not move. He did not speak. 180 motorcycles were parked in silence around the courthouse entrance. The riders stood beside their machines or leaned against the wall, and none of them looked at Marcus Greer directly. And that was somehow the worst part of it, to be in a parking lot full of men who were not there for him, who did not see him, who had come entirely for an 81-year-old woman who had put on her good coat and whispered 6 words to a stranger. Delbert Conway met him at the courthouse steps with the injunction. Agnes Faye Morrell stood on the steps in her wool coat. She was not trembling. She stood straight, with a dissolution notice in her hand and 57 years of Leland Road behind her. She looked at Marcus Greer, and she did not look away. Greer looked at the injunction. He looked at the parking lot. He turned and walked back to his car. He did not say a word. The Ohio Attorney General's office received a formal referral regarding Greer Land and Title Solutions at 9 that morning. Within 60 days, 2 additional fraudulent liens against elderly homeowners in Callaway County had been reversed, and 4 more were under review. The pattern that had been invisible for 2 years was no longer invisible. Hatch Dillon left Callaway at 7:20. He was 2 hours late to his sister Carol's birthday breakfast. He called her from the highway, and she answered on the first ring and asked where he was. He said he had stopped to help someone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that sounded like him, and the way she said it made clear she meant it as the complete thing it was. They stayed on the phone for 20 minutes, which was the longest they had talked in 4 years. Agnes Faye Morrell drove home to Leland Road at 8 o'clock in her old Buick with the cracked taillight. She parked in the driveway. She walked up the porch steps, the ones Eugene had built level by level, checking the spirit level 3 times on each board, because once it's done, it's done. She put her key in the lock. She pushed the door open and stood in the doorway of the house she had built with her hands and her husband's hands on a lot they had paid $6,000 for and given 57 years of living to. She stood there for a long time. Then she went inside. The deed to 1104 Leland Road, Callaway, Missouri, has Agnes Faye Morrell's name on it. It still does. If this story found something in you, if you believe that no one should lose the home they built with their own hands to a piece of fraudulent paper, share it today with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. And drop a comment. Have you ever had someone show up for you when you had stopped expecting anyone to come? Tell us 1 sentence in the comments. Just like Agnes.